Many of you know my parents were missionaries and they went to India 1945. And a conviction that many people had at that time was about not wearing jewelry, including not wearing wedding bands. Well, they got to India, and over time, as people really got to know them, they started to have more and more questions from the Indian people, wondering, what's going on? Who is this woman who you're living with, and what's your relationship? See, in that culture, every state has a specific sign for marriage, and every person in the state, every woman wears that particular sign. It happens to be a necklace, and with a very specific symbol then on that necklace. And in that culture, they just could not understand these two people who were here. They seemed to be married, but there was no sign of the marriage. It was really interesting over time as my parents worked with that and worked with the culture that they now were living in, and were just tried to think about their conviction about whether or not they would wear a wedding ring or wear jewelry generally. And so it took some time, because I remember when my dad came back from a trip and he gave my mother a wedding ring. It was not a huge change in their lives, and yet it was. And it was a movement to really be closer in understanding with the people that they were now living with in the country of India.
So when I was 9, I was baptized and became a member of the Brethren in Christ Church. And at that time, it was, you were obligated to put on a head covering, and a lot of times even wear a plain dress with a cape to it. And so, being the oldest and the compliable personality that I was, that was just what I did. I wasn't forced to do it. It was what I wanted to do. I went to school. I wore the head covering. I wore it all the time here at church and any other place. We became involved with a lot of people who weren't Christians. We did a lot of visitation for the church and were interacting with a lot of people. And it got to the place where, was the covering really necessary? And so then I started wearing a chapel veil, which I only wore during worship services. And I remember it was a process, because when I was thinking about taking off the chapel veil, I would have been the first deacon's wife not to have a head covering. Until one Sunday morning, I remember, it was at the old church at the corner of High and Marble Street. I went up to the altar to pray with someone, and I had lost a straight pin, one of the straight pins that held on my head covering, my chapel veil. And at that point, I thought, if I did what I felt like, I'd take this off and put it in my purse. And it was just like the thought came to my mind, if that's all it means to you, why are you wearing it? And that is the last time that I wore my chapel veil. It gave me more freedom and more liberty to just be myself. But at the time, when I was a child and younger, it wasn't something that I felt obligated to do. It was because I wanted to do what the church wanted and what my parents wanted, and so that's just what we did.
This question about a symbol of marriage in the country of India was something that really did get in the way for others to understand what was going on, because they could not understand marriage without a symbol that also said these two people are married to each other. And so it seemed like something illicit was going on rather than wholesome. And in that culture, not wearing a wedding ring said just the opposite of what sometimes we maybe were trying to say in this culture.
I think it would have opened more doors for me to become closer friends with people if I wouldn't have had the head covering. I have been glad in years since that my children did not have the trappings that I had, and that people would be able to see that they were Christians and loved the Lord because of their lifestyle and not because of the way they dressed.
I think that there really is this dilemma of how are we in the world but not of the world, and so there are many convictions that we end up living out. Perhaps one of the problems that I've heard as Marlene has told her story is that in some times within the church, we've taken a conviction and made it an absolute, and then said, no, you just have to do it. Because I've heard Marlene say, well, this is what was expected of me, so I just did it, rather than this is what I come to understand.
We had a pastor one time, I think it was Pastor Ken Hepner, that said we should be insulated in the world but not isolated. And I felt like that maybe my head covering isolated me to the point that I did not have the boldness to stand up and share what I believed in, whereas our kids had much more courage to stand up and talk about what they believed. And I think that when people can see your heart and not have to look past the outward trappings, it's easier to have an impact and be an influence on people's lives.
We always are asking a question, what's cultural about being part of the church, and what is really just about salvation in Jesus Christ, and then other things will start to take their place.